7 years, over 20 rounds of negotiation, and with 20 chapters covering a wide range of trade-related topics, expectations are high for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The RCEP is poised to become the world's largest trade agreement involving the 10 ASEAN members, including the Philippines and its 5 major trading partners, namely Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. So what are the potential scenarios for RCEP as participants aim to get this broad trade agreement signed by next year? With us now for more from London is Stuart Patterson, Research Fellow at Heinrich Foundation. Good to have you back on, Stuart, and welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. Now, the Philippine Finance Secretary describing the RCEP as a game changer for closer economic integration between China and the ASEAN. Do you agree? And can it have the potential of helping all nations achieve steady high growth and reduce poverty in an even more impactful manner?
Well, it's a great question, and I think he's putting a fairly optimistic spin on the potential. Of course, the first thing to say is that we haven't seen the text, the detail of the agreement yet, and the devil is always in the detail. So if the agreement does build significantly on the existing bilateral free trade agreements that already bind the participating nations together very heavily, actually, in terms of trade patterns, then there is the potential for the RCEP to be growth enhancing and to lead to greater flows of investment and trade. But we have to bear in mind that the signatories to this agreement are already heavily entwined. The framework, the legislative framework for trade and investment, there is one already. So the question really is, how far does this new agreement go in terms of deepening that relationship? And of particular interest, I think, will be areas pertaining to investment, the dispute mechanisms that are going to be put in place, because one has to remember that China is going to be the dominant power in the RCEP. China's GDP will account for about half, more than half the total GDP of this trade bloc. And therefore, the potential, the risk here is that this agreement becomes something that allows China to take a disproportionate share of any gains from trade that materialize from the agreement.
Right, you talked about how China's share in that whole RCEP deal is, but what about India? India is opting out. What are the implications? The agreement now it becomes just between the ASEAN 10 alongside China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand.
Yeah, so I think we have to put the Indian decision to opt out at this stage in context. First of all, it is worth saying that the door has been left open for India to join at a later stage should they so wish to do. The second observation I would make is that certainly the perception coming from the Indians seemed to be that it was a failure to agree with China on safeguards pertaining to export surges that was the deciding factor in India's decision, which I would say is worrying, because that unwillingness perhaps of the Chinese to compromise there in order to make the agreement more inclusive could be viewed as a sort of a bad omen as to the direction in which patterns will develop in the future. But you have to remember that India, economic reform and trade liberalization in India are always controversial topics, and there are very powerful political interests in India, producer interests that historically have argued for protectionism. It's agriculture in particular, obviously, with a large amount of the voting population coming from rural areas, but also in manufacturing. And so India's decision not to join, perhaps it's disappointing, but perhaps it's the right one for India. We won't know, or we cannot possibly tell until we see the detail of the text. But the fact that the agreement was not one that a cautious India was prepared to sign up to is perhaps worrying when the details come out in the future.
Right. Well, China said on Monday, meanwhile, that it's agreed to impose higher penalties for IP rights violations as a compromise to reach a trade deal with the United States. What impact will the RCEP have then? Will RCEP increase or decrease China's dominance of regional trade?
Well, I think the two things are slightly divorced from each other. I mean, China's promise with regards to intellectual property, well, the proof is in the pudding, as it were. We've had plenty of promises in the past which have not been fulfilled upon. In terms of China's increasing dominance of the region and how RCEP might either facilitate that or help constrain it. I think the big issue here is the type of economic institution that China has vis-a-vis, for example, ASEAN, and their ability to capitalize on trade agreements such as the RCEP. Because, typically, a large number of ASEAN countries are made up of, they're dominated, the economies are dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. These companies find it hard to take advantage of free trade agreements and preferential trade agreements simply because they don't enjoy the scale that is required to export and import. China, on the other hand, obviously the commanding heights of the Chinese economy are dominated by huge Leviathan-size state-owned enterprises. And such companies benefiting from scale, benefiting from the state capital and industrial policy of the state, are very strongly positioned to take market share abroad when they are allowed to be let loose in foreign markets. So in terms of the way in which the regional comprehensive economic partnership might increase the signification is really because of the nature of Chinese economic institutions and companies and their ability to capitalize on agreements such as this.
Right. You mentioned signification. So will RCEP indeed accelerate the signification of Asia or reinforce a WTO rules-based trading system? Could, however, China agree to any compromises with the U.S., dictate the manner in which China could or would engage with the region on rules-based trade?
So I don't think so. I'll answer the final point first. I mean, with the bilateral relationship between China and the US will have to be thrashed out between those two parties. China's compromises that are required to first of all, I would say that a return to the ex-ante status quo is not possible in the US-China relationship. That the breakdown of trust and the realization that this is a great power struggle for hegemony has been dawned, and that genie cannot be put back in the bottle. So what we're talking about here is whether China and the United States can find some sort of economic relationship going forward that is mutually beneficial, and it remains to be seen how deep that would be. But I suspect that it's going to be a lot shallower than the current relationship, which then means that when we start looking at the Asia Pacific economic region as a whole, there becomes a kind of geopolitical rivalry here in terms of spheres of influence. And one interpretation of the regional comprehensive economic partnership, it's not the only possible interpretation, but one would be that this could become a sort of Sino-centric trade bloc, increasing China's sphere of influence in the region. America seems to be favoring much more a bilateral approach to trade. Obviously, under Trump, they've opted out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. So the RCEP could well become a sort of Sino-centric trading bloc, enhancing the sort of geopolitical power of China in the region. And that's something I think the Americans will be keen to guard against, and so probably should be the other signatories of the RCEP, which is why I think that they're viewing it as being more a bloc that can help contain China to some extent, but having India in there would have been a big help in achieving that goal.
Understood. Meanwhile, as a final point, you cite a caveat in your write-up that the RCEP agreement could end up dragging participants even further into China's sphere of influence. What negotiating leverage would that give China over other signatories, and what impact would that have on a relatively smaller market such as the Philippines?
Well, I mean, we've already seen demonstrated, over the last 10 years or 20 years even, China's willingness to use geoeconomic tools. In the case of the Philippines, obviously, we've had, the sort of fruit bans on fruit imports into China, which have hit politically sensitive constituencies in the Philippines. In the case of Taiwan, we've had the issue with the sort of catfish fishermen. We've had the embargo on rare earths to Japan. So China is not shy of using its economic leverage to achieve political goals. Okay. And clearly, the deeper the relationship between a country such as the Philippines and China, the more dependent the Philippines becomes on the Chinese market or Chinese investment flows, then obviously the greater that leverage is that China has over the Philippines. And so when it comes to disputes about the South China Sea or the East China Sea, I mean, clearly, if growth in the Philippines becomes too dependent on China, then China has a lot of leverage over the smaller countries. And so this is a cause of huge concern. I think it should be a cause of huge concern. And it argues strongly for the ASEAN 10 and other players in the region to be grouping together to counteract that leverage that China has.
Lots of takeaways there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stuart Patterson of the Heinrich Foundation from London. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.